Subcommittee of the Whole on Supply will now come to order. We are meeting today to consider the estimates for the Department of Justice as outlined in Resolution E13, which reads, resolved that a sum not exceeding $392,342,000 be granted to the Lieutenant Governor to defray expenses in respect of the Department of Justice pursuant to the estimate. So with that, I recognize the Minister of Justice. You have 1 hour for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon to my colleagues. First, as I begin today, I would like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I'm pleased to be here to highlight the work of the Department of Justice, and as I like to call them, the Justice League, to speak about our priorities for the coming year. I've had the privilege of serving as the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice for about the past 2 months. In this time, I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the tremendous work and dedication of staff who work tirelessly to address the impacts of human trafficking and domestic violence, advance efforts to eradicate systemic racism in the justice system, and advance accessibility and keep Nova Scotians and our communities safe. Before I move on to detailed remarks, I'd like to offer a bit of an overview of the department's key areas of focus, which include policing, public safety, administration of the courts, including courthouse security, transport of persons in custody, civil enforcement, and support to the judiciary, correctional services, including community and custody programs, and services for adults and youth, supports and services to help victims of crime, enforcement of court-ordered child and spousal support payments, implementation of the Accessibility Act, and providing legal services to the Government of Nova Scotia and its legal entities. This work is delivered through our many divisions, comprising of public safety and security, court services, correctional services, policy and information management, strategic initiatives, maintenance enforcement, victim services, and the Accessibility Directorate and legal services. I would like to acknowledge my Deputy Associate Minister, the Associate Minister, senior executives for their preparation of the department's budget submission, and staff throughout the department for their tremendous work throughout what has been a very challenging year. Mr. Chair, in addition to having responsibility and oversight of these divisions, I also have responsibility for the Public Prosecution Service, the Office of the Police Complaints Commission, the Public Trustee, the Nova Scotia Medical Examiner Service, the Serious Incident Response Team, or CERT, the Human Rights Commission, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Tribunal, and the Office of Information and Privacy Review. Mr. Chair, our budget for 21-22 is just over $392 million, a budget increase of $18 million or almost 5% compared to last year. The department's budget highlights are focused on advancing our commitments to Nova Scotians through the delivery of responsive and accessible programs and services. This last year has certainly been heavy for Nova Scotians. Almost every aspect of our lives has been impacted by the global pandemic. The presence of risk and heightened response to public safety has meant that we have all had to make changes. And this holds true for the work that we do within the department, where priorities were quickly realigned to respond to the needs of those we serve. Just as we were coming to realize the enormity of this pandemic, Nova Scotia experienced an unimaginable tragedy and the largest mass casualty in our country's history. As we approach 1 year from the events of last April, our thoughts remain with the families and others who experienced harm. Our response to the pandemic and to the tragic events of last April have had significant impacts on the work of the department over the past year, as have the social movements spurred by the unfair and traumatic experiences of African Nova Scotians. These events have given cause to reflect and ensure that the needs and interests of all those that we serve are integrated into all we do, from policy development to program delivery. We take a preventative approach with the work we do, aiming to break down systemic racism, to break the cycle of repeat offenses, and eliminate barriers to access across the province. Mr. Chair, this work, as is the case in all we do, is driven by and must continue to be driven by collaboration with justice partners, victims, survivors, persons with disabilities, Indigenous people, African Nova Scotians, and all others we serve. This year's budget looks to the future with investments in Nova Scotians who have not had the same historic opportunities as others. Mr. Chair, addressing social justice issues are among the highest priorities of our department and the justice system as a whole. Fairness, equitable access, opportunity, and participation are the principles that guide our work. These are translated into our efforts to expand diversity within our workforce. We recognize that to accomplish our goal of eradicating racism, that it's also important that we focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion within our own department. To that end, we now have a senior advisor of equity and inclusion focused on working throughout the department to support the implementation of our multi-year diversity plan. The principles of equitable access, opportunity, and participation also guide our work on accessibility and on ensuring that all who are served or supported and are kept safe by our just system of justice have the opportunity to direct needed changes. For many Indigenous and African Nova Scotians, systemic racism and discrimination is a lived reality. The racial inequities and imbalance of opportunities they have endured have had lasting and significant impacts. For more than 300 years, many African Nova Scotians have been living on land passed down by their ancestors without clear title. Without legal certainty of ownership, many residents in these communities are unable to exercise all of the benefits of land ownership that the rest of us take for granted, such as obtaining a mortgage, dividing or selling their land, accessing housing grants, or building equity in their homes. Legislation introduced this session and supported by all parties aims to build further trust, create positive and lasting change, and address this historic injustice. $1.3 million has been allocated to the department in this year's budget to support accelerated work under the Land Titles Initiative, including the hiring of a dedicated executive director, which will be served by community leader Angela Simmons, and two commissioners, the Honourable Corinne Sparks and the Honourable Valerie Miller, to adjudicate disputes. These hires will allow for negotiation, mediation, and voluntary arbitration of claims and create broader authority to administer the initiative. This budget allocation is part of a more significant investment to help speed up efforts under the Land Titles Initiative, which also includes a $3 million compensation fund to resolve cases that involve parties with competing claims. Mr. Chair, historical disparities and an imbalance of opportunities often result in added barriers for those who come in contact with the criminal justice system. We know that many African Nova Scotians and Indigenous people have not had positive interactions with the justice system. These experiences and the role that we had in shaping them must be considered in the advancement of our work to eliminate discrimination and break down systems of inequality. Our aim is to listen, learn, and improve. Although we know that a tremendous amount of work lies before us, I truly believe it is important that we acknowledge the concerted efforts undertaken by staff and by government to address these issues. For more than 25 years, we've supported the Indigenous, Blacks, and Mi'kmaq initiative at Dalhousie University's Schultz School of Law. That's an initiative that has done so much to increase access to legal education and promote diversity in the legal profession. We need talented lawyers who understand the background and circumstances of those they serve. This is especially important for those communities who have long been underrepresented in the legal profession and yet overrepresented in the criminal justice system. Our courts have also become more specialized and more reflective of those who come before them. A prime example of this is the Indigenous Wellness and Gladue Court at Wegmacook, which supports the cultural needs of Indigenous people accessing justice. The court reflects and respects the Mi'kmaq experience and perspective, and provides a response that is culturally mindful and sensitive to Indigenous cultures. This court sits between 1 and 3 times a week. It's equally important that context and culture be considered when sentencing African Nova Scotian offenders. Race and cultural impact assessments are an important tool that can help courts to understand how systemic racism or other background factors may have contributed to a person's interaction with the criminal justice system. They're similar in substance to Gladue reports. They address the impact of systemic racism on offenders. The department provides funding for these cultural assessments, which were pioneered right here in Nova Scotia, and which will soon be adopted federally, providing more access to justice for African Canadians across Canada. Mr. Chair, in cases where African Nova Scotians or Indigenous people receive custodial sentencing at one of our provincial facilities, we work to ensure that their cultural needs continue to be served and that they continue to have connection to their communities. African Nova Scotian and Indigenous liaison officers support inmates, educate staff, and work with cultural community agencies and support providers to address cultural needs of individuals in conflict with the law. Correctional services coordinate the delivery of culturally responsive programs, including the Red Road Sharing Circle, respectful relationships for Indigenous individuals, case management support for African Nova Scotian and Indigenous inmates, smudging and sweat lodges, and cultural gatherings, including drumming and traditional meals. Although the delivery of these programs has been impacted by COVID, we have been working and providing programming virtually when possible, and individuals in custody continue to have opportunity for smudging when deemed safe to do so. We're continuing to foster and develop partnerships with cultural community service providers and leaders, including 902 Man Up, the African Nova Scotian Decade for People of African Descent Coalition, the Nova Scotia Brotherhood Initiative, and Mi'kmaq Elders to better support Indigenous and African Nova Scotian clients. Currently, we are exploring how we can work directly in cultural communities to increase the availability of and access to correctional services programs. We're also working with the Nova Scotia Community College and community cultural partners to support success in post-secondary education for Indigenous and African Nova Scotians who are involved with correctional services. Mr. Chair, another area of significant interest and focus for both African Nova Scotia communities and the department is police interactions. Respectful interactions between police and citizens are essential to safe communities and effective policing. All Nova Scotians deserve respect and equal treatment that is free from discrimination. And that's why my predecessor and this government banned street checks in 2019. We continue to take action to advance recommendations in the Wortley report, including the extension of time frame for filing a complaint against a municipal police officer to bring it in line with the time frame for the RCMP. This change took effect in January. We've also established a research committee made up of members of African Nova Scotian communities from across the province and representatives from African Nova Scotian organizations, including Game Changers, 902, the African Nova Scotian Decade for People of African Descent Coalition, and the Association of Black Social Workers. The committee also includes representatives from police, government, the Human Rights Commission, the Nova Scotia Association of Police Governance, and is supported by an expert academic. This group is tasked with recommending a race-based data collection model for police stops, and their work is ongoing. Following the release of the Wortley report, the department provided police with funding to support training for law enforcement. These funds have been used to help police agencies enhance their cultural competency through training modules related to ethics and accountability, and racially biased policing. More recently, we collaborated with the RCMP to facilitate the delivery of the RCMP's African Canadian Experiences, or ACE, training to municipal police. We will continue to engage with police, community, and other stakeholders as we address the recommendations from the Wortley Report. Mr. Chair, in the coming year, we will also work with African Nova Scotian Affairs, African Nova Scotians, and other justice stakeholders to inform the development of the African Nova Scotian Justice Plan, and we will continue our work with Indigenous communities to develop and advance an Indigenous Justice Action Plan. This work will help ensure the province's justice system better meets the needs of these communities and that we break down the harmful impacts of systemic racism. Right now, this is a time for fundamental change and a revisioning of how we deliver justice. As the Minister of Justice and Attorney General, I commit to you that I will champion these efforts. Another area of considerable focus for the department is intimate partner and sexualized violence, including domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation. The harms of these crimes are felt by children, youth, adults, families, and communities across this province, and have a disproportionate impact on equity-seeking communities. We have and continue to deliver trauma-informed training and sexual violence training to frontline officers, providing them with the knowledge, skills, and ability to effectively handle the complexities of these investigations. In 2019, we stood up a dedicated human trafficking unit. Having a provincial team dedicated to this work is critical to our intervention efforts and ability to convict offenders. This past year, we expanded this unit with the hiring of a crime analyst and an administrator. Mr. Chair, we've also committed $1.4 million a year over 5 years to fight human trafficking and provide more supports and services for survivors. This includes the hiring of an additional Crown prosecutor to specialize in human trafficking cases, along with specialized training for Crowns, the hiring of 3 family and victim support navigators, and the reassignment of officers from the Additional Officer Program. Once in place, those officers will be dedicated to investigating sexual assault and domestic violence cases and working alongside the Human Trafficking Unit, prosecutors, victim services, and community organizations on human trafficking cases. Our investment also includes funding to the Elizabeth Fry Society of Mainland Nova Scotia for the hiring of youth program coordinators focused on teaching our youth how to protect themselves from human trafficking and exploitation. Government has also made several investments over the past few years to help support victims of domestic violence, including opening a new domestic violence court program in Halifax and making the existing court in Sydney permanent, investing $5.2 million to support the construction and renovation of shelters and transition homes for victims of domestic violence, and changing the Labor Standards Code to allow victims of domestic violence to take up to 16 continuous weeks of unpaid leave, including 3 days of paid leave. Mr. Chair, a partnership was formed this year with Nova Scotia Community College to provide an online domestic violence learning service so that external stakeholders, such as police and community service providers, can access key training 24/7. A new domestic violence training module and competency-based curriculum project is currently under development with a specific focus on enhancing police and service provider response in these cases, using a human-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally relevant approach. Mr. Chair, we know that the barriers experienced by women with disabilities in situations of domestic violence are significant and troubling. This was made evident in the Not Without Us, Changing the Response for Women with Disabilities Experiencing Domestic Violence report, released in July. The report identifies 13 key recommendations in areas including disability training for law enforcement officials, navigation and outreach supports, and cultural considerations. The Accessibility Directorate, along with representatives of other government staff and community stakeholders, formed a working group to develop a framework with key milestones and outcomes. The framework will be informed by analysis of accessibility barriers impacting women with disabilities experiencing domestic violence, and will identify concrete ways and actions to remove and prevent these barriers. Mr. Chair, Nova Scotia is also working with New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador to address and prevent domestic violence and domestic violence-related homicide. In December, the Council of Atlantic Premiers announced the establishment of the Atlantic Domestic Homicide Review Network, the first regional review network of its kind in Canada. This network will enhance information sharing, ensure joint consideration of existing system responses and prevention efforts, and learn and identify best practices and areas for improvement and collaboration across the region. This will help us map the best path forward for Nova Scotia and Atlantic Canada to address domestic violence, better support victims and survivors. At the same time, we're finalizing regulations for Nova Scotia's death review committees, and will proceed with the establishment of both a domestic violence death review committee and a child death review committee. Mr. Chair, the confinement of people to their homes because of the pandemic increased risk to those facing domestic violence. In response, the Department of Justice and Status of Women initiated and co-chaired a COVID domestic violence coordination working group with representatives from government and community. The aim of this group was to provide rapid response to emerging issues during the early stage of the pandemic. This included providing transition house clients with transportation by our sheriffs, continued delivery of victim services supports in person, by phone, email, and online, and having regular contact with Crown attorneys about bail hearings, corrections regarding any releases. Mr. Chair, we know that women and girls who are victims of intimate partner and sexualized violence are vulnerable to later becoming involved in the criminal justice system themselves. It is important that supports are in place to help these women break the cycle. We recently invested $360,000 in the Elizabeth Fry Society's Holly House to continue delivering its around-the-clock support to women and increase the facility's capacity. Women served by Holly House have direct access to collaborative and preventative government supports provided by the Departments of Justice, Community Services, Housing and Infrastructure, and Health and Wellness. These services include educational support from correctional services teachers, regular and direct access to Nova Scotia Health Authority, addictions therapists, and housing support workers. Our work with Holly House will result in more positive outcomes for more women and ensure they are able to easily access the supports that they might need to move forward. This past year, we were an active participant on the Domestic Violence Law Enforcement Committee of the Nova Scotia Chiefs of Police Association. We also oversaw a review of high-risk protocols to ensure consistency in police response and community supports to victims. Mr. Chair, in the coming year, we will continue to work with the Department of Community Services and the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women to implement Standing Together, a provincial action plan to prevent domestic violence and to support victims of domestic violence. This work will focus on reviewing gaps in programs and expanding current initiatives offered by the department to prevent future violence and support people affected by domestic violence. Particular attention will be paid to historically marginalized and equity-seeking groups. Mr. Chair, we will also support the continued implementation of domestic violence courts in Sydney and Halifax. This includes creating consistency in policies, programming, and service delivery, collaborating with community-based agencies and partners, and continued monitoring and evaluation to respond to emerging issues in the field. We will ensure stronger supportive connections between families experiencing violence and child protection by working with our partners at the Department of Community Services and the Domestic Violence Court Program Working Group. This will help create better information sharing between matters in criminal court and family court proceedings. And we will continue to work with the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women, Elizabeth Fry Society, Association of Black Social Workers, Mi'kmaq Legal Support Network, Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, and Transition House Association of Nova Scotia to ensure culturally safe programming is linked to the Domestic Violence Court Program. Mr. Chair, staff in our Maintenance Enforcement Program continue to advance work on behalf of Nova Scotia families. Cooperation among provinces and territories and the federal government is essential for enforcing support orders when payees have moved to another province. Work is underway in 3 areas, with sub-working groups attached to each. 1, to trace and locate, which aims to find ways for federal, provincial territories to share best practices and improve the ability to find payers or debtors who have either gone missing or are evading enforcement activities within and across jurisdictions. 2, bank garnishments, which looks to gain consistency and a common process for information gathering and garnishment of bank account assets for payers and debtors. And 3, secure electronic documents. It involves developing a secure platform for provinces and territories to exchange documents. Mr. Chair, I would like to shift now to another critically important area of the department, and that is accessibility. This year, the Department of Justice will continue to lead the implementation of the Access by Design 2030 strategy and the Government of Nova Scotia's accessibility plan, which are guiding Nova Scotia toward our goal of being an accessible province by 2030. This year, we are investing an additional $320,000 in the Accessibility Directorate to support the implementation of government's work on accessibility. This additional funding will allow the Directorate to maintain its current staffing complement, along with the hiring of 2 more staff in the Accessibility Directorate to support this critical work and help guide the work of future standard development committees. Work on the province's first accessibility standards continues. Community experts from education and the built environment, the majority of whom are persons with disabilities, have submitted their initial recommendations, which we plan to advance for consultation later this year. Both committees are now developing their second phase of recommendations. We'll soon be announcing the 3rd area of focus for standard development and establishing a committee to help guide this work. Work is underway now on the development of a provincial public awareness campaign to increase Nova Scotians' understanding of accessibility, the rights of persons with disabilities, and barriers faced by persons with disabilities. Mr. Chair, the goal of an accessible Nova Scotia is only possible through the collective support of all sectors and of all Nova Scotians. Public sector organizations, including municipalities, universities, and libraries, are valuable partners in meeting our goal of an accessible province by 2030. These organizations have undertaken many efforts to advance accessibility over and above their requirements for the development of accessibility plans and the establishment of accessibility committees. We know that the pandemic response has impacted their ability to advance some of this work. That's why we've given the prescribed public sector bodies an additional year to meet the requirements. But that being said, progress is being made. The Accessibility Directorate has been providing valuable support, including developing resources, toolkits, guidelines, and delivering webinars. The Municipality of Chester, District of Lunenburg, Town of Mahone Bay, Town of Lunenburg, and Town of Bridgewater, they all collaborated to produce a joint accessibility plan, which was recently adopted by each municipal council. Their regional accessibility plan outlines the overarching goals for improving accessibility in Lunenburg County. Now, the individual municipal units will be releasing local accessibility action plans, which will provide more details on the actions within their specific region. Mr. Chair, an important part of meeting the goal of an accessible Nova Scotia by 2030 will be ensuring compliance and enforcement with the Act and its regulations. The Accessibility Directorate is developing the compliance and enforcement framework for the Accessibility Act using a collaborative and consultative approach. Working groups of government and community stakeholders have been established to draft framework options. Mr. Chair, our dedicated team in the Accessibility Directorate are continuously engaging with persons with disabilities, gaining insights into this important work and ensuring that the programs we deliver account for the differing abilities of all Nova Scotians. This work has been especially important as we have adapted in response to COVID-19. While the impacts of COVID-19 have been felt by everyone across the province, we recognize the additional challenges created for persons with disabilities. In March of last year, the Accessibility Directorate reached out to community organizations across the province to inquire about critical issues related to COVID-19 that were arising for Nova Scotians with disabilities. They then worked with relevant departments and community partners to ensure prompt and proper response, including more direct outreach to persons with disabilities with updates on services, providing telephones and other technology to those self-isolating, and delivery of in-home testing. Staff with the Accessibility Directorate continue to work across government to help address concerns raised by Nova Scotians with disabilities during the response to the pandemic. Mr. Chair, how we work and the work we focus on has changed in response to the pandemic. Public safety served as a primary stream of information for police regarding public health orders related to COVID-19, which resulted in a substantial shift in our operations. Our Correctional Services Division worked directly with public health to develop and implement a robust COVID-19 prevention plan in our provincial correctional facilities. We have worked proactively to protect the health and safety of those in our custody and our staff from the virus. Among the measures we've been taking and continue to take include reducing the number of individuals in custody. We continue to manage releases as we have since mid-March 2020. Inmates within 30 days from completion of their sentence continue to be considered for early release as part of their case management plan. To date, 41 inmates have been released with 30 days or less remaining in their sentence. An additional 105 intermittent sentence inmates have been released. Mr. Chair, the COVID-19 support variation pilot, led by our maintenance enforcement program, Nova Scotia Legal Aid, and court services, was created to provide out-of-court solutions to help address COVID-19 related child support matters. The pilot was developed in response to clients who are financially impacted by COVID-19. In some cases, layoffs, reduced working hours, and other changes in employment have impacted the ability of people to make court-ordered child and spousal support payments. The pilot, which ran from March 2020 to March 2021, was set up to help those who find themselves in these circumstances get a temporary change to their payments from the courts. Our courts have also responded, operating initially under an essential services model and expanding the services available when and where it was safe to do so. Health protocols adopted in response to COVID-19 prompted the assessment of all courtrooms and courthouses across the province for their capacity to accommodate in-person matters. When public health protocols have not allowed in-person proceedings, matters have been heard by courts virtually, using telephone and video online platforms. Domestic Violence Court and the Dartmouth Wellness Court have continued to deliver programming and services throughout the pandemic, and both courts have continued to sit using virtual technology. The community-based service providers who support those who appear before the Domestic Violence Court have been able to adapt, delivering services virtually in many cases. The Desmond Inquiry was able to resume evidentiary hearings in February at the courthouse in Port Hawkesbury, which allowed for the required physical distancing. A dedicated victim services officer has been on hand to provide trauma-informed support to the families throughout the inquiry. Jury trials were able to resume outside of Metro Halifax as of September 8th, using offsite locations or by reconfiguring existing court infrastructure. However, the 4 criminal jury courtrooms at the law courts in Halifax were not large enough to accommodate criminal jury trials in compliance with COVID-19 restrictions. The province recently opened a satellite court capable of hearing criminal jury matters within the Halifax Regional Municipality. This facility is the first criminal jury courthouse in Atlantic Canada, perhaps even in the country, built to be COVID-19 compliant. It serves as a great example of how we have been able to adapt and transform our operations in response to COVID-19 and to prioritize the importance of access to justice. All spaces in the new courthouse allow for the required physical distancing and are accessible for those using mobility aids. The courthouse also accommodates on-site jury selection and juror deliberations, and is also equipped with state-of-the-art audio-visual systems, including digital recording and evidence presentation systems. With the addition of these 2 satellite courtrooms, we've been able to safely resume criminal jury trials in the Halifax area. The response to COVID-19 has highlighted ways to better use technology to update court services and improve access to justice for our citizens. The province's new e-court pilot program was launched last summer, providing an online platform where family legal counsel for both parties can engage in real-time online exchanges with a judge for dispute resolution. It includes electronic filing and exchange of motions, affidavits, and other court documents, virtual conferencing, and the creation of an electronic record of all online proceedings. It also better supports those who would otherwise need to arrange for childcare, transportation, time off work, or other accommodations to attend the court in person. The program, Mr. Chair, is the first online judicial dispute resolution service in the entire country. Another initiative we have undertaken to transform the courts is the development of task force, chaired jointly by the Department of Justice and the Judiciary. This task force will explore more ways to use technology to improve access to justice, increase efficiencies, and ultimately create better outcomes. The response to COVID-19 has highlighted ways to better use technology to update court services and improve access to our justice for citizens. And this work will build on changes that have already been implemented in our courts and create opportunities for future innovation. Mr. Chair, it's important that we talk not only about the benefits of technology. As we know, smartphones, social media, and online channels continue to be used as a means of cyberbullying and the unwanted sharing of intimate images. The impact of these behaviors can be devastating for victims. The Intimate Images and Cyber Protection Act was adopted in response to the growth of these issues. This year, the courts awarded damages in the amount of $85,000 in the first successful case brought under this legislation. This court case, along with greater awareness of the supports available by the CyberScan unit, is sending the message that these behaviors are not acceptable and will not be tolerated here in Nova Scotia. Mr. Chair, this past year has been hard for all Nova Scotians. In addition to the fear and loss faced by many due to COVID, we also experienced a mass casualty that resulted in the loss of 22 Nova Scotians. As a province, we came together to show our support for families and communities, and we continue to be there for them. The Victim Services team worked tirelessly to ensure those who experienced harms were supported and assisted to receive trauma-informed support and counseling. We opened support navigation centers in the communities of Portapique, Debert, Shubenacadie, and Wentworth to offer in-person support to those impacted. On-site navigational services were an extension of the supports provided by our existing victim services officers in collaboration with other justice partners. While Victim Services has core programming and a standard service delivery model, these tragic events led us to make adjustments and adapt to meet the unique needs of the community. While we've since transitioned our physical presence outside of the community out of respect and to allow them to continue to heal, we do continue to work with and be available to these individuals to provide necessary supports. Mr. Chair, a joint provincial federal independent inquiry has been established to examine the circumstances around last year, April 18th and 19th. This work is critically important to getting answers and to helping ensure that nothing like this happens again. Parallel to this work, there are things we can do to help prevent the recurrence of a similar tragedy. This session of the legislature, I introduced legislation that will further restrict someone from being able to access items that would facilitate impersonation of a police officer. I appreciate that there's no way to entirely eliminate all risks, but I do believe that these efforts will mitigate against the most significant risks. I appreciate the support that my colleagues provided to that piece of legislation. I also recognize that the use of the province's public alert system is a topic of interest. And I want my colleagues to know that discussions about our alert ready system are ongoing, being led by the Department of Municipal Affairs, the Emergency Management. Now, Mr. Chair, I'll just say a few words about the Public Prosecution Service. The Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service represents the Crown in all criminal proceedings and was the first independent prosecution service in Canada. The Public Prosecution Service employs more than 100 Crown attorneys and about 75 support staff in 18 offices across the province. Our Crowns handle about 50,000 criminal code charges every year. And on top of that, they handle trial court appeals. In addition to prosecuting all criminal code offenses in Nova Scotia, the Public Prosecution Service is responsible for prosecuting some 10,000 violations of provincial statutes annually. Major cases are complex and often high profile and require a significant amount of time, skill, and dedication from more than one Crown attorney. Public safety and the public perception of the justice system are influenced by the outcome of these cases. The Public Prosecution Service makes it a practice to assign at least 2 Crown attorneys to each murder case, with at least one being a senior Crown attorney. And this is essential to professionally respond to the demand of these difficult cases. Crown attorneys with the Services Division of Appeals and Special Prosecutions provide advice and prosecute major and complex prosecutions. These can include organized crime, murder prosecutions, complex fraud cases, historical sexual assaults, proceeds of crime cases, cybercrime, and child pornography offenses, provincial regulatory offenses, and cases related to Aboriginal law. I'd now like to take a few moments to talk about the challenges facing the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service and this government's efforts over the last couple of years to support the Public Prosecution Service in successfully meeting these challenges. A growing concern for the province has been a significant increase in human trafficking. In fact, Nova Scotia has the highest rates of human trafficking in Canada. Over the next year, the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service will be able to focus more intently on this criminal activity. Last year's budget allowed the Public Prosecution Service to hire a new Crown attorney dedicated to prosecuting human trafficking cases. The new Crown is also participating in the delivery of specialized training to other Crown attorneys and collaborates with our justice partners in combating this horrific crime. On the diversity and inclusion front, the Public Prosecution's Equity Committee provides a culturally sensitive lens to the conduct of prosecutions involving race-related issues. The committee oversees training in cultural competence. It is also currently working on the development of a prosecutorial policy to address the fair treatment of BIPOC involved in prosecutions. The prosecution services continues to be especially vigilant about case delay to ensure that accused is tried within a reasonable time period. In 2016, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that all Superior Court cases and all trials which have a preliminary inquiry will have a time limit of 30 months from the date when a charge has been laid to the completion of the trial. For provincial court trials, the time limit is 18 months. The most successful initiative the Public Prosecution Service has undertaken to combat delay is the establishment of an intake team. in which five dedicated Crown attorneys conduct arraignment days, perform an assessment as to realistic prospect of conviction, contact complainants who appear to be hostile or recanting to further assess file viability, and provide direction to police for necessary follow-up, and communicate with defense counsel about possible early resolution. The intake team, originally based in Dartmouth Provincial Court, has had very positive results, reducing time to trial in that court from up to 2 years to a year to 2 to 3 months. With this year's budget approval to continue the intake team, it will continue its work from Halifax to deal with the backlog there. Avoiding delay will continue to be a major priority for the Public Prosecution Service for years to come. With the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Public Prosecution Services staff began to work remotely where feasible. Nova Scotia Crown attorneys quickly adapted to delivering prosecutorial services virtually and immediately joined a collaborative effort to reduce remand populations. The pandemic naturally led to delays overall, and the Public Prosecution Services continues to be an active participant in efforts to address those delays. Before I close, I want to share some important work being done in Nova Scotia by both the government and the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission. The past year has brought into focus for many of us what staff at the Commission have known to be true for a very long time. There's a problem with racism in Nova Scotia, across our country. While our government has taken bold steps to demonstrate our commitment to addressing systemic racism, the Commission continues to administer the Human Rights Act through its investigation and education. As the coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic struck and public health restrictions came into effect, staff at the Commission were positioned to adapt and began immediately to deliver virtual training. Custom human rights training sessions mandated to address workplace and organizational issues of discrimination moved online, facilitated by Commission staff, and use of the Commission's virtual classroom training modules increased. Nearly 30,000 Nova Scotians have completed the Commission's courses aimed at educating Nova Scotian employers and staff on ways to prevent consumer racial profiling, sexual harassment, and improve workplace equity for people with disabilities. The Commission will continue to expand its training offerings and administer the Act over the coming year as it works across government and with the private sector to enhance our awareness of the importance of protecting the rights of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Chair, before I conclude my remarks, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the entire Department of Justice team for their commitment to the people of Nova Scotia. They accomplish great things every day, and I thank them for it. I look forward to the opportunity to respond to my colleagues' questions through the remaining time of estimates debate for 2021. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. And now we'll go to the Progressive Conservative Party. I recognize the honourable member for Queen Shelburne. You have about 12 minutes left before we go to break.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and his department for being here today. Congratulations on your new department, Minister. Always look forward to having conversations with you and look forward to working with you in your new role. Thank you to the staff that do great work. We've seen that in the bills that have been put forth in this legislative sitting. So my gratitude to all of them. I'm going to start talking about domestic violence. I actually read an article the other day, and although it wasn't a provincial article, the headline said, "A pandemic within a pandemic, intimate partner violence during COVID-19." And sadly, one of the most tragic consequences of this pandemic has been the reports of intimate partner violence right across our nation. People confined to their homes that with stay-at-home orders, people laid off work, schools closed. And for many of us, home is our safe place. But for others, it's not. they're trapped by their abusers. So my question to the minister is, could he advise if his department has seen an increase of intimate partner violence during this pandemic here in our province?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, off the top, I thank my colleague for acknowledging the work of the staff, and I'd like to acknowledge all of my caucus, not just caucus, all of my legislative colleagues. As the member mentioned, I had the privilege of introducing 3 important pieces of legislation this session, and all 3 have received unanimous support of the legislature. So thank you for recognizing and acknowledging that to the member. To the specific question, 100% we all agree in terms of the issues and the challenges, and we have seen issues and reports on a national basis. As far as the stats in Nova Scotia, that's a retrospective piece. So kind of on an annual basis, we work to collect the data and report back through Statistics Canada, and Statistics Canada pulls it up. So we don't have the provincial specific data at this point, looking at last year's data. So often that data comes through after the fact. But we do certainly operationally take the steps to work with victims who do come forward to ensure that appropriate investigation as well as support services are available to those victims and families of domestic and sexualized violence.
Member?
Thank you. I'm hoping that maybe you will have these statistics available. In 2019, the rate of police reported domestic violence against females in Nova Scotia increased by 14.3% compared to the 2016 numbers. This is higher than the 10.4% rate increase for Canada. Does the minister have any insight about whether this trend is continuing?
Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for the question. Again, really, the systems set up in the department for reporting that have been around, I think, for a long time, it really does do kind of retrospective reporting of the data that comes through. The work that the department and our partners really are focused on is as the cases come through and making sure that the resources are there. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, this was an area that we recognize as important to Nova Scotians and important to the government and our partners, which is why, as I mentioned, several of the investments and focused initiatives that we have brought forward in the last couple of years, and we continue to support in this coming year's budget. Initiatives like the Domestic Violence Court that was initially piloted in Cape Breton and Sydney. Recognizing the success of that pilot, we made it a permanent court and also expanded and developed and established a court recently in Halifax for the same purpose. That work also expands to, we're talking domestic, but we know the similar types of issues when you transfer over into other sexualized violence and gender-based violence through things like human trafficking, as well as I mentioned earlier in my remarks. I won't repeat them here just for the sake of time, but human trafficking focused supports investments as well.
The honourable member.
Thank you. That'll move me right along into human trafficking. And I know my colleague from Pictou West has lots of questions, so I won't talk a lot, but I do have some questions. the numbers released by Stats Canada in June shows that Nova Scotia is one of the worst provinces, along with Ontario, for human trafficking. And since becoming justice critic, I have tried to educate myself as much as I can to learn about this absolute horrific crime that happens. And as a mother of 2 girls, I can tell you it frightens me. I know the government has committed to the 1.4 million a year over the next 5 years to support new and current initiatives to try to address efforts with human trafficking. So I want to just actually ask for a couple updates on some of those things that the province is stated they're going to do. One was hire family and victim support navigators for Halifax Regional Municipality, Cape Breton Regional Municipality, and the South Shore. I'm wondering if the minister could please advise if these navigators are in place.
The Honourable Minister.
Sorry, I was just, there were 4 positions. 3 of the 4 have been filled, and I believe it's Cape Breton that has been approved, but remains to be filled.
The member for Queen Shelburne.
Okay, continuing with this question, can the minister confirm that the specialized training for Crown prosecutors, if that has been completed?
The Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for the important question. Yes, we have the dedicated Crown prosecutor in place, as mentioned in my opening remarks, and the training has taken place. But I think that type of training will be an ongoing, obviously, as you have more prosecutors and opportunities. So training has taken place, but anticipate that training will continue as part of professional development and ongoing kind of operational necessity within public prosecution services.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you. And I certainly can appreciate, that fact, Minister. And I'm assuming that would be the same for our frontline officers. Is there a percentage of our frontline officers that have not received this training, or are we pretty much up to date with our officers that are in the field now?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the important question. Unfortunately, this particular specialized training for frontline police officers, it is provided by an organization in Ottawa. And as a result of COVID and travel restrictions and so forth, we were not able to send our officers up for that training. We remain committed to it, obviously, but again, when you look at the relative success of Nova Scotia in managing COVID and been able to manage some within public health guidelines, in-person types of training and so forth, that hasn't, if you look at the results in Ottawa, COVID is far more prevalent and so forth. So it remains important and we're committed to it. But unfortunately, the nature of the training and the COVID pandemic has not allowed us to get that training completed.
The member for Queen Shelburne.
I can appreciate travel restrictions. We're certainly living in a world of Zoom and virtual meetings and trainings. So, hopefully we could maybe even look at if there was a possibility to do that type of training. I don't know exactly what's all involved, but looking at something to do virtual training. I'm going to stay with my human trafficking questions. In 2020, the department indicated that it would be launching a series of roundtables across the province to hear directly from Nova Scotians who have been impacted. Can the minister please update on these sessions?
I would ask the minister to keep that question in mind as we take our required COVID break for 15 minutes. We'll resume at 1:35. The Subcommittee of the Whole on Supply resumes, and we'll go back now to the Honourable Member for Queen Shelburne. You have 48 minutes left.
Maybe I'll give the minister an opportunity to respond to that question I asked before the break.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for the important question. So with the community programs and consultations on the, and I just try to remember if I remember the question correctly. On the one hand, we had done community engagements, my predecessor, over a couple of years with victims of domestic violence and so forth. And then in the last year during COVID, the intent, obviously pre-COVID, was to do a similar activity in the area of human trafficking. Again, with that work, we'd be engaged with community partners and so forth. And again, COVID has disrupted a lot of things, especially things that would be designed around in person and so forth. So those engagements have not taken place. However, I assure you the work has not been forgotten. I've been advised that even within the last week or two, there have been engagements with some of our partners to reestablish and get back on track with those consultations. And in addition, I would note, last year there was additional funding for partners like the it's not the IWK, I forget my former role, like the YMWCA. I believe over $300,000 to support in this area of engagement and awareness and supports. And I know in the fall, that organization did provide information session open to the public. I believe all MLAs were invited to attend that session up here in Halifax. It was after the first wave, but just before the second wave started up in I think, October timeframe. So a lot of good information and engagement shared there. And I'm going to go back to your first question, just so that if it comes up more around the stats and the data piece, I just got a little bit of clarification when I mentioned, Stats Can and so forth. If there's any, just to clarify the way that data gets reported. So this is going back to your earlier question about the data and domestic violence and so forth. The statistics, I forget the federal legislation that governs Statistics Canada, it actually mandates all police agencies to report this information when, at the point of charges and so forth. So that data, that's why it goes through Stats Canada. It doesn't get reported to us in the department and the province. And Stats Canada generally reports on an annual basis. So we would expect to get the data in the summertime for the previous year of operations. What the province gets is when things kind of enter into the court system and so forth. So Stats Can gets when it's reported, we get when the charges, and then it enters really our prosecution and through that side of the justice system here in the province.
The Honourable Member.
I'd like to share with the minister. I had a conversation last week with a teacher at the middle school in my constituency, and she shared with me her concerns about the importance of creating awareness, especially in rural communities, because we're certainly not immune to these perpetrators coming to our communities. And she went on to say that she does teach about stranger danger, human trafficking within her class, but is very concerned that there is not an awareness in the communities about these real dangers. And she went on to say that she felt that, although she's doing her part, that it was a real responsibility of the province and of justice to make sure that those messages are out there. So I want to share that with the minister so he's aware of a perspective coming from someone from rural Nova Scotia and a teacher. And I'm wondering, is there any plans or could there be community engagement sessions. It was great that we had the YMCA do a session for us MLAs to learn more, but what about getting out into actual communities and having these type of information sessions?
The Honorable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the member for highlighting a very important topic, and to the I don't know if it was a constituent, but to that educator, please pass on my personal gratitude to them, both in my formal capacity and role, but also as a father. Any Nova Scotian that takes initiative to tackle such important issues in their community and to share to keep our youth safe ought to be recognized and commended. So please, as it relates to what we can do and what we are doing or have done in the Department of Justice, I think there's a recognition in these areas, and you might have seen or caught this theme in my opening remarks, that so much of the investment, so much of the work we do is actually not just the Department of Justice. It's the work we do with our partners, and whether they're partners, because it's such a complex. So human trafficking, it touches so many, so the partners with policing services, with the public prosecution services, we need to educate there. And you're right, we need to educate in the community. And so we've partnered with community organizations and community services opportunities, right? People who work with vulnerable populations. So through some of our community partnership investments, I mentioned earlier, investments for the YMWCA, that funding is to help through education and information programming. We also have victim services supports that are distributed in communities and so forth. Primarily focused off the top with victims themselves and supporting them, but we also support organizations like the Association of Black Social Workers who are in community and in many cases with vulnerable community groups to help get this information and message out there. But I do take your point, and particularly with youth, and particularly recognizing that there are vulnerable populations where this type of horrible activity, those who would be a perpetrator, those perpetrators recognize those vulnerabilities and tackle them. And while we recognize that often socioeconomic factors, other certain equity seeking groups, whether they be gender based or racially based, all contribute to higher probability of being targeted. I do take the point that the teacher you referenced and yourself, many people in our society who have not been exposed think it cannot happen to them or their families. And I think it's an important message, and so I'll share it here, that it could be anyone. In fact, I had a conversation as recently as last night with a personal contact about sexual assault, broadly, and they made reference to a particular incident that they became aware of a friend of theirs, proper upbringing, recent graduate or near graduate of an undergraduate program that was being groomed and nearly transitioned into that world. And that individual did not necessarily fall into what would be considered the normal or high risk category of individuals. So that education, that information, that awareness, recognize personally how important that is. And I think those staff members and those who work in the space recognize it as well. So point well taken. And again, I hope you realize there are some initiatives that can help support it, but there's always room to do better.
Member?
Thank you. And thank you, Minister, for that response. I certainly agree. And I think you've heard me speak in the House before on many other issues, whether it was opioids or, our children becoming victims of bullying, drug use, where none of us are immune to our, children. So we certainly, there has to be an increased awareness. I do want to share with you one other conversation I had, because I think it's really important to take this time to share this information with you as the minister, because this is how we fix things. I had a social worker in my constituency reach out to me last week, and she shared with me that she is deeply concerned. She works in our school system, and she's deeply concerned about the increased sexual assaults amongst students, so kids that are in the school system. And she did talk a little bit about the Kids in the Know program, but is disappointed that hasn't been rolled out as aggressively as it should. So I know you mentioned, you have partners and, everyone works together, and that's what we have to do in order to tackle these issues. But I'm wondering if there is a plan, especially now that you know this, and maybe you already have, about these increased sexual assaults among students in our school system. Is there a plan for your department to work very closely with the education department to make sure that we're implementing curriculum? I know my colleague from Pictou East, I'm sure she'll talk about that later with you. But is there a path going forward that you see that you're going to work more closely together to address these issues?
Thank
Minister?
you.
Minister?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I jumped the gun there. We're just getting into like a coffee chat here with my colleague, so I apologize for that. Again, another important point. I'm not sure, again, I've been here for just a couple of months, so I'm not sure what conversation or engagement has been had between the two departments to date. But I do know my colleague well. I know he has a strong awareness and background and personal connection to the education system that predates his appointment to that department. And I too, again, not just as a parent with children in the education system, but engage there as well. So we know that with the cyber safety legislation, that it included provisions to ensure that there are presentations being done in schools and information being brought out to schools. As you mentioned, there are some other forum programs out there. So there are steps. Is it enough? How much more needs to be done? I'll take it a step further. I think, and I anticipate we're going to have, I know how passionate many members of the legislature are, so I suspect this will be a frequent theme over the coming hours. So just want to share this anecdote so you understand how I'm, I guess, guided on the principles and how things, how I see things, I guess. Through a conversation I had with a teacher, a few months ago, prior to being appointed here, so more of a general conversation, they made a comment about an experience where their child came home. So just coincidental, I suppose, that they happened to be a teacher, but their son came home from school in an elementary school and was crying because some of the children in that school, some of the other boys, called him a girl. And my lot of people, probably in society, some of us even perhaps in this legislature, wouldn't think twice about hearing that on the playground or something. I mean, on the spectrum of insults and language used by some children, that would probably seem pretty minor. But the interesting conversation I had took that to another level, making the point that that's actually the start of gender-based violence. That message delivered by those other children in the playground sent the message to her son that there's something wrong with being a girl, which implicitly sends the message that there is something superior to being a boy. And not even delving into the conversation of other gender identities, and the challenges and the psychological and the social challenges that youth of identifying with other genders have, even in the more traditional binary, that imbalance that gets created at such a young age. And I shared this story. I know this is a far jump from a child being called a girl by their playmates on a playground. And I know those youth wouldn't be thinking about it this way, but we do have to recognize that it is those simple or seemingly simple and oft overlooked statements that represent the systemic issues we have in our society. Oft accepted language and insults that are jokes or intended in days past, or that there's more damage done than we normally think about. And so that's, I just wanted to let you know that that's a far cry, that example from human trafficking and sexualized domestic violence and so forth. But I just wanted to let you know that awareness of how the seeds get planted and the systemic and societal structures that are in place. And that goes to show how complex it is to tackle these issues in those areas. But I just wanted you to be cognizant that I am aware and sensitive and open-minded to that awareness, so that will help inform the work that I do as we work through these things. And as I mentioned, specifically to the question about programming, we do have the cyber safety legislation and that the cyber scan units and the work that they do with presentations in the schools, which gets done, but also provincial police teams do some training and supports as well, but they're just not there now with the COVID protocols limiting outside people coming into the school system. So again, on the radar, aware, and I can't truly speak for my colleague in education, but I know, again, a father, a strong proponent, even before being appointed, of education. These are shared values, I think, of all of us in the legislature and executive council.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Minister, for your response. You mentioned cyber safety legislation, and you've heard me speak about this before. It is something that is very, very close to my heart. I had a daughter that was bullied absolutely terribly, and there was no one to help back then, nobody. And it was the worst thing you ever could imagine as a parent, not being able to help your child. So I'm very passionate about our cyber scan unit and our cyber safety legislation. The former Minister of Justice is very aware of that as well. I'm wondering if you can tell me how many applications were received by the cyber scan unit in this last year. I know in the past it was something like 258, but how many applications were received? How many were resolved?
The honourable minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have the summary. Oh, actually, enforcement outcome. I just, the way that the data's not collated down, I'd have to do a quick scan on this. There were listed 181 requests to the CyberScan unit for the calendar, not fiscal, calendar year 2020. So January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020, 181 requests for assistance. 89 of those cases involved an adult respondent versus an adult victim. I won't go through all of them, but the higher numbers, 16 cases was a youth respondent versus a youth victim. And there's some smaller individual ones. 27 cases involved an adult victim who did not know the respondent. So I guess anonymous bullying or circumstances. 29 cases involved an outside agency. Again, the others are then less than kind of in that 2 to 5 number of reports. I won't run through all of those. The outcomes, and I don't have these broken out by the nature of the request, but I'll just hit some of the big ones. Well, I'll conclude with, there were 2 open files. So the rest would have been resolved to some degree, and the types of resolved are, we provide assistance to other agencies that have come in. There are some informal processes that educations and mediation and so forth that would have brought it to resolution. There were about 22 that through the informal processes found that the complaints were unfounded, but they did provide advice and assistance to the parties. But there were also takedown notices. There was social media advice and engagement and so forth. 4 instances went through the restorative justice process. And there were 10, though, unfortunately, that were unresolved because we haven't been able to identify the respondent. So again, by and large, the agency through as a structure to engage and work with the parties to educate and resolve the circumstances without necessarily requiring the courts, again, depending on the circumstances, seems to be relatively successful. And as I've said, based upon this data, it shows that there's 2 open files based upon the 2020 submission, I believe.
Member?
Thank you, Minister, for that information. We're hearing a lot from seniors, and I actually, before I became an MLA, spent some time working with the Queen's RCMP detachment as a senior safety capacity, and did a lot of work with seniors on fraud awareness. And frauds and scams, they're running rampant in our province. Our seniors are becoming victims of these fraudsters daily. I realize that they're very, very hard to catch. And we have our Canadian Fraud Center, but it seems as if more and more seniors are becoming victims, and we educate and do everything we can. But is there anything that the department feels that they could do to try to, I guess, find these perpetrators and have them stop, or to further educate seniors? It's just, it seems like there's too many seniors being taken by these people.
Minister?
Thank you for your patience. It is as you, the member, Mr. Chair, alluded, I think, to the complexity of particularly these online and the growth of the online, which aren't always digital online, but phone calls often are a starting point for these types of scams. And, you may think of scenarios where it's, you receive a call. So imagine yourself as a grandmother or grandfather, and you receive a call, and someone says, your grandchild is in jail and needs some money to bail them out, and here, go on the computer and click this link and send the money, or go to the store and wire me, the money, and you're not necessarily thinking clearly. So that's the circumstance and the context. So in terms of how important prevention is in these scenarios, as the member mentioned, Mr. Chair, we do support our senior safety coordinators across the province. We provide grants and supports in communities, and they deliver programming and supports within communities, grassroots, to reach out to our senior population to try to help inform of these and other types of abuses that could take place. I mean, this example, we're talking financial. As it relates to the question of how do we get the perpetrators, it is what makes this very complex, because they often, in many cases, transcend national borders. That is, although a call may come to Nova Scotia, the perpetrator is not in Nova Scotia. And so there's national and international jurisdictional components. So what does happen is they do get investigated. We report the data here up to a federal international fraud program, and they pursue and take steps to investigate and try to take the steps needed in those countries. And I think it's well known. Certain international jurisdictions tend to way more predominantly, I think, in as an originating point for these types of issues. So again, our national partners working to try to tackle it from that way. And I know that, again, the RCMP as a national body also work to provide education to the public, how to identify various scams, including email scams and so forth. So there are public education initiatives as well that take place kind of at the national level out to the general population. But I'll put this out there too, as again, a bit of a reminder. We can each work to communicate and support and work with our safety coordinators as MLAs to have some of that information, to get some of the information from our RCMP or policing agencies if they have some of that material, and use our offices as MLAs to help distribute and get that information out into the community as well. Because I know in my office anyway, in rural Nova Scotia, many of the in-person visits are from seniors in the community. So it's a good source point that we can all play as members of the legislature to support that education initiative as
well. The member for Queen Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the minister advise if there is a provincial police study being done in the province by an independent group?
The Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Slightly complex question coming from different perspectives. So on the one hand, I know recently, and I guess let me back up, just to make sure that our colleagues, and I know as a critic, my colleague likely knows this, but I don't know that our colleagues necessarily would be aware. So if you just a brief context for our colleagues. That policing in the province really has two key points. There's provincial policing, where the province has a contract with the RCMP to provide policing services in the provincial purview, but then municipally, there are municipal policing requirements. And that's why you see in some communities a municipal police force. Where I come from in Antigonish, the municipalities there, the town and the county, actually their municipal contract is also with the RCMP. So, it's the same agency providing services. So, but in others like Halifax, HRM, they have a municipal force. So recently there was work being done, or a motion, I believe, passed by Halifax Regional Municipality Council for them in their municipal police force to conduct a review. So that was a motion there. The other area is, of course, the inquiry, the public inquiry relating to last year's mass casualty incident. Obviously, at this point in time, really the anniversary period. But that commission's terms of reference includes a provision to evaluate policing services. So that is an independent body. So I guess getting to the heart of the question, I don't know if the member was asking more on that municipal, and so I use the HRM just to let her know that that's happening, Mr. Chair. But then in the mass casualty public inquiry, there are terms of reference for that inquiry to look at policing across the province, and that is an independent body and process.
Honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for the response. I want to talk about mental health liaison officers. At the local hospital, there is a full-time mental health liaison officer at the CBRM. We know that many of our officers are being held up for a long time in many occasions at local hospitals, and which is creating tremendous overtime, burnout of our officers, trying to backfill those positions when the officers are supposed to be in on shift the next day, but they've worked 17 hours that day. Is there any consideration of the province to look at putting mental health liaison officers in our regional hospitals?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Specific resources that are deployed within our hospital infrastructure, our hospital sites, falls to the Nova Scotia Health Authority and the IWK Health Authority. So they would identify the resource needs. Obviously, predominantly those resources are medical in medical facilities, and they bring their budgetary requests and needs to the Department of Health and Wellness to pursue. I think if you're looking at something like a dedicated police service, it would really be at the request of our health system, identifying that as a need and a priority if they needed policing services or supports on site. To my knowledge, I can say I haven't had conversations either in my previous role nor in my current with the health authority. In other words, that specific conversation hasn't come up to my knowledge.
Member.
Thank you. I mean, I am fully aware that there are many officers that are held up for hours at hospitals, with the patient. And I just think that you're in a great role now, Minister. You have that health background, and now you'll have the justice portfolio to really figure out how to resolve this issue, because it is an issue amongst officers. They spend a tremendous amount of time, an awful lot like our EHS, our paramedics spend a tremendous amount of time waiting to offload when they want to be on the street. And it's the same as our police officers. So just certainly something that I think you're in a role now with the background knowledge to try to change. Very quickly, because I know my time is running out, can the minister advise the status of the courthouse in Shelburne?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two quick things. One, a little bit response to the previous one, and then a request for clarification. As it relates to the police officers piece, I do take the member's suggestion noted, and I do think that is an area of conversation, specifically, not just necessarily in the hospital's context, but I think that conversation more broadly about police and how they the role that policing provides in mental health response, crisis response. So it's not just in the hospital environment. I think there's aspects and elements that I'm aware of as well. And when responding to individuals in crisis, when there's a risk to an individual or to others, police are the lead there, and so I know there's a lot of discussion and work about where's the line. I mean, on the one hand, it's a mental health crisis. That's not the expertise necessarily of police individuals on the front line, but we have mental health experts who don't have the safety training necessarily to enter into an unsafe environment, and so it's this challenging environment to ensure that we provide the help that individuals need, whether it's in a hospital environment or in community. And so I do hope that I'm able to work within the department and with our partners at health to, as we continue always to look for improvements, make some progress there. To the member's question, I apologize for this specific on this one. The courthouse, what context? I'm not sure what you mean by the status. Do you have something specific that was supposed to be done there, or that is ongoing?
Well, there was a situation at one point of trying to look at moving the courthouse and the municipality building. Is there still court services being offered in Shelburne?
Thank you. Okay, so I've got the context. I appreciate that. So my understanding is that services are still provided Shelburne. Obviously, with COVID, as with many locations, there may be also other means. So there may be still virtual sessions taking place when appropriate and so forth. So it doesn't mean everything is necessarily heard there. But to your point about some work or evaluations about the location, my understanding is infrastructure obviously is responsible for infrastructure for government proper, but also our partners in the third branch of government, the court services. And so they're still looking and in discussions about potential new space. But there hasn't been a final decision. I will assure the member that should negotiations and a final or new home be locked in, we'll be communicating that publicly.
The honourable member.
Thank you. The minister mentioned in his opening remarks some of the things that he's responsible for. And one of those is the Nova Scotia Office of the Police Complaints. And I'm wondering how many complaints has the Nova Scotia Office of the Police Complaints Commissioner received over the past year? And how many were not investigated?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank the member for the question. And I do just want to highlight, and I know I reference in terms of being responsible for the commission, want to make sure everybody's clear on the fact that the commission operates independently, though. What it really is, just like the Human Rights Commission, CERT, and others, these are actually independent bodies. However, as legislation created or established these bodies, it also identifies their independence. It just needed a, quote unquote, home, particularly from a budgetary perspective, to fall through. So responsibility is predominantly just in terms of ensuring they have the financial resources and so forth. And as the minister responsible for that legislation that it comes to. As far as the data on the specific numbers, I don't have that with me. I know we have some more time, so I've asked staff to try to pull it together. I'll probably do a little intervention when I get that data. Even if it's on someone else's answer, I will try to get it as part of our discussion later today.
The member for Queen Shelburne with about 6 minutes left.
6 minutes. Wow. What can you get said in 6 minutes? I'm going to move on to maintenance enforcement. What percentage of court-ordered child and spousal support cases are currently in arrears? Sorry, Minister, I didn't mean to make you laugh.
Just looking up that information, Mr. Chair, and I'm sorry, I was giggling earlier. I think my colleagues on the session here would like to comment on what I can say in 6 minutes, and I think most of them say I can clear my throat in 6 minutes. But just 1 second, I think I have the data. So there's different ways. I think in the legislature, I commented at one point about lies, damn lies, and statistics. So you can slice this information in a number of different ways. So I'll respond to it in a couple of ways. From a financial amount, there is just under $52 million in total arrears, and this is up to February of 2021. So this date is current to February 2021. So just under 52 million, $51.9 million total. That is a decrease of about 18% from March of 2018. So we're moving in the right direction. Now you could, you could also ask that question from a slightly different perspective, which is how many cases are in arrears? And that number is 4,443. It is a decrease of almost 30% from March of 2018. So I think that was the question that you had, but some relevant stuff. We've increased the number of enforcement actions that we've taken. It's I don't have the relative increase, but it's at 22,500. The number or the percentage of cases where arrears have reduced. So we've reduced in cases, so the arrears might still exist, but the dollar figure of those arrears have gone down in 42% of the cases at the end of fiscal 2020, at the end of Q3. And we have an increase of 45% from March of 2018. There are 53% of active cases with no arrears. So that's a 45% increase in the number of cases with no arrears. So I know the question was about what is the status of arrears, but I thought it was also important to highlight the improvements in cases without arrears. And to put all of this in context, the arrears levels in maintenance enforcement are at the lowest levels they've been in over 15 years.
Member, 3 minutes.
I'm extremely pleased to see that, Minister. That is great work. It's definitely going in the right direction. How many of those cases that are in arrears would be interjurisdictional? So like cases that the children would live here in Nova Scotia, but the the payer would be, say, in Alberta or a different province. I know those sometimes can become even more difficult to collect. So if you could give me the number of those cases.
Minister.
I'm going to look into those numbers. I'm going to jump back to the earlier question, though. I did get the information that had been requested. So in 2020, the Office of Police Complaints Commission received 138 complaints from public, 40 internal complaints. Of those, 27 complaints were dismissed. I don't have the details as to the breakdown of reason for that. 7 were abandoned and 7 were withdrawn. To put the number of complaints in context, in 2019, there was a total of 177 complaints. So there's a reduction of about 39 fewer complaints in 2020 versus the previous year. And as it relates to the maintenance enforcement interjurisdictional, I don't have that information on hand here, but I will note that from a financial amount, $25.8 million is the amount that's being enforced by other jurisdictions on behalf of Nova Scotia. So I don't necessarily have the case number, but that's the fiscal amount that is being enforced by other jurisdictions.
Member with under a minute.
Under a minute. Can the minister tell me quickly how many officers have been trained as DREEs?
Minister.
If I don't get it before the time elapses, I will try to sneak it in on the next member's answer.
Order, please. The time for the PC caucus for their hour has expired. I'll recognize now the member from Dartmouth South with 12 minutes before we go into our COVID break. The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've enjoyed listening to this exchange, and welcome to the portfolio, Minister. I want to thank the member for Queen Shelburne, who always advocates so strongly from her personal experience, and I think that's really making a difference, and I appreciate it. So I just want to mention that. I think for those of us with children in the chamber, that's so much of what drives us, and so I'm always touched to hear you advocate for the experiences that your daughter went through. I want to begin today by asking about some community supports, particularly for criminalized folks. So we've talked about this a little bit this session, including in question period, but at the onset of the pandemic, Coverdale and Elizabeth Fry Society, who both work with criminalized women, were federally funded to provide housing and wraparound services to people released from custody, and the courts and particularly Judge Williams did a really amazing job in avoiding a catastrophic consequence in our jails in terms of COVID transmission, at least so far, with those releases. But when that federal funding was ending, the Deputy Minister of Justice wrote her counterparts across government urging the province to step in. So all those releases, that was a provincial action, but all those folks were housed with federal funds. And when those federal funds dried up, there were no provincial funds. And as we know, we are in the midst of an extraordinarily tight housing market, particularly in the HRM, and a lot of those folks were coming from Burnside. The Deputy Minister requested help and approval from Finance to distribute funds without delay, and that request was denied. And I'm wondering if the Minister can explain why that was. So why did the province not step in to support housing these folks who are on remand, who did not pose a threat to the public, and who were, not in a correctional facility, both because they didn't have to be, but also for their own safety?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank the member for the question. I'm going to apologize quickly. To the previous member's question, there are about 80 active DREs in Nova Scotia. That was 80, just about 80. To the specific question about the services, first and foremost, as I noted in my opening remarks, we obviously rely on our partner organizations like Elizabeth Fry, Holly House, and so forth. And they've served us and served the people of Nova Scotia very well to help ensure access to justice, but also improve really what is an important component of our justice system, which is not punishment, but rehabilitation and the probability of success. Our best outcome is to result in resolving underlying issues that may have resulted in or led to the engagement. So we know our partners like Elizabeth Fry perform these works. I think it's important to note that as government, we actually, just earlier to that request, increased our funding to Elizabeth Fry and Holly House by over $350,000 for some specific provincial programs and so forth. I appreciate and I hope the members here can appreciate the challenge it is for a government to be in a position to cover funding cuts from other entities. We have to work to build our budgets and our priorities and our initiatives within the frameworks and the priorities and so forth that we have, and we work to do that in conjunction with partners and provide funding and so forth. Unfortunately, in the Department of Justice, we don't have really much of a funding bucket that I would classify as kind of grants, which would provide us with a certain level of flexibility or freedom to be responsive to, I'll say, unanticipated requests for additional funding with our partners. But as it relates to the specific request around that the member referenced, I think it's also important to note, I believe the Department of Community Services or Status of Women have provided some additional funding as well, just in recent weeks. But from a program and a policy perspective, as the member noted, what had been rolled out as part of the pandemic was rolled out fairly quickly. What we're working on and trying to establish from a provincial perspective, recognizing the potential value is something with permanency and sustainability that we can work with our partners to achieve those outcomes. So I believe work is still ongoing, but we're looking at long-term holistic steps to achieve the objectives that the member is referencing and the outcome.
The member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you. I thank the minister for that answer, but I feel like there's a lot to unpack in it, and I'm going to just take a minute and do that. And so one of the things is that the funding that was granted to Elizabeth Fry, which is in my constituency, while I know welcome and while a great step for government, was not in fact an increase. So if you look at the ways that Elizabeth Fry Society had patched together funding through the years from various government departments, that announcement of stable funding, which is something we've advocated for, which is great, was necessary, but wasn't a massive increase. So I just want to clarify that it about equaled the amount of government support they had been getting in a patchwork of ways that administratively was much more burdensome. And that money also wasn't about housing. So that was really money that the government needed to be providing, in my view, to Elizabeth Fry. And I know that, I've had this conversation with the minister, and his former portfolio is health. It's our assumption that when the government refers to its partners, that they are partners. And so in this case, with folks like Elizabeth Fry and Coverdale, courts will mandate that they take certain courses, that people being released from incarceration will take certain courses, or complete certain things that they do through Holly House and Elizabeth Fry. And so to me, it follows that those organizations should be funded to provide those courses if they are being ordered by the government. So we are glad to see that. But also, again, I want to clarify that this question is not related to the Law Foundation cuts that these organizations received. That's another question I have. And yes, that wasn't government funding, but this is specifically around housing. And I'm glad to see the minister acknowledge the need for a longer term, more sustainable solution. And that solution is some kind of community-based bail housing. And so at the federal level, when people are on remand and they are considered low risk or they have significant medical issues, I know there are people in Burnside, who are ill and in their 80s and, they're not going anywhere, but there is no program to release them safely into the community. And so that was sort of something that came together in a patchwork with this federal funding, but that hasn't been continued. So I'm wondering, the minister alluded to the fact that they were looking at a more permanent solution. I'm hoping this is what he's referring to. And I'm wondering if the minister can tell me about any conversations he's engaged with around this, and particularly whether organizations serving women are involved, because I know that there are conversations, that there is a table, but the last I heard, neither Coverdale nor Elizabeth Fry was at that table.
Minister of Justice. Order, please. Again, we've reached the time for our COVID-19 break, and that'll give the minister more time to get the answer from the honorable member. So we're back again at 2:50.